Hi everyone. Thank you for participating in today's webinar on the newly released CACFP Meal Patterns Final Rule. My name is Laura Carroll and I work in USDA's Food and Nutrition Services. I'm a nutritionist and work on the Child and Adult Care Food Program and the Summer Food Program. So before we get started, I want to go over some logistics. In the bottom left-hand corner of the webinar tool, you will see a chat box. We are going to take some breaks periodically throughout the webinar to answer your questions, so any questions you have, you can submit through that chat box. There's no need to take any notes today because we are going to send out an email after today's presentation with the slides that I am using. In addition, today's webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available as a webcast for you to share with any colleagues that were unable to attend today, and you can use it as a basis for your trainings. Once the webcast is available, we'll send out a notification on PartnerWeb. First, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you that commented on the proposed rule for the CACFP meal patterns. Your input was absolutely instrumental to the development of the final rule. Your comments allowed us to develop new meal patterns that are achievable, that are cost neutral, and introduce healthy foods to children early on in life that will help them learn healthy habits that may last a lifetime. So thank you for taking the time and the effort to write thoughtful comments that really were very important for us. We have a jam-packed webinar today. I will first go over the new requirements in the infant meal patterns and the child and adult meal patterns, including the changes that we made from the proposed rule to the final rule. Then we'll briefly discuss the optional best practices and our implementation plan. Throughout the webinar, we will take breaks to answer your questions, as I mentioned. Before jumping into the new meal pattern requirements, I want to go over the development process of the rule and the implementation date. Here's a simplified illustration of how we got to today. As many of you know, the proposed rule was published a little over a year ago. It was then open for public comment, and we received nearly 8,000 comments. We then took all those comments and analyzed them. We conducted research when necessary and developed a final rule. The final rule was made public on Friday, April 22nd, and was officially published in the Federal Register just 2 days ago on Monday, April 25th. The final rule establishes an implementation date of October 1st, 2017, meaning that CACFP centers and daycare homes will need to comply with the new meal patterns in about a year and a half from now. We certainly encourage sponsors, centers, and daycare homes to begin implementing the new requirements as soon as possible and as feasible, whatever is feasible for them. As I go through the new requirements, you'll see that there are some new allowances in the meal patterns that are currently not allowed under the meal patterns. We expect to make some accommodations on some of these new allowances so that they may be implemented at an earlier time, and we'll issue additional guidance on that soon. This is the first major revision of the CACFP meal patterns since the program was first started in 1968. The Healthy Hungry Free Kids Act of 2010 required USDA to update the CACFP meal patterns to better align them with the dietary guidelines for Americans and the most recent nutrition science. The new meal patterns I'll be talking about today are based on the dietary guidelines for Americans, recommendations from the National Academy of Medicine, which is formerly known as the Institute of Medicine. And we also relied on recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics, in particular for the infant meal patterns. And of course, the new meal patterns are based off of your public comments. The new meal patterns are designed to ensure children and adults have access to healthy, balanced meals throughout the day. Under the new meal patterns, young children and adults in daycare will receive meals with more whole grains, a greater variety of vegetables and fruits, and less added sugars and solid fats. In addition, the new infant meal patterns support breastfeeding mothers and increased consumption of vegetables and fruit. We really focused on incremental changes that balance the science behind the nutritional needs of the diverse CACFP child and adult participants and the practical abilities of the diverse centers and daycare homes to implement these changes. Now let's jump into what's new. First up is the infant meal pattern requirements. The final rule establishes 2 age groups for infants instead of the current 3 age groups. This is consistent with what we proposed. The new age groups are 0 through 5 months and 6 through 11 months. This is primarily done to encourage exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months of life, as recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics, or AAP. The old meal patterns allowed solid foods to be introduced as early as 4 months of age. However, AAP found that the introduction of solid foods prior to 4 months of age is consistently identified as contributing to later overweight and obesity. Additionally, these new age groups now match the age groups in the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, also known as WIC. The proposed rule would have required that solid foods start being introduced at 6 months of age. Many commenters, though, expressed concerns that that would be too restrictive, and we agreed, because the individual development readiness for solid foods varies among infants. Further, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends introducing solid foods around 6 months of age, not exactly at 6 months of age. With that, we modified the final rule from the proposed rule to allow solid foods to be introduced before or after 6 months of age as the infant is developmentally ready to accept solid foods. This new flexibility in the final rule allows daycare providers and parents and guardians to really work together to determine when and what solid foods the center or daycare home should start serving. And it's consistent with the AAP. Here you'll see a comparison chart of the old versus the new meal patterns for infants. The minimum serving size ranges for the 6 through 11-month-old age group was modified from the proposed rule. They now start at 0, so solid foods can be introduced gradually. These new serving sizes ranges also recognize that not all infants are ready for solid foods directly at 6 months of age. The solid food components in the 6 through 11-month-old age group are required when the infant is developmentally ready to accept it. Recognizing the benefits of breastfeeding, commenters overwhelmingly supported allowing a center or daycare home to be reimbursed when a mother directly breastfeeds her infant on site. Consistent with other FNS efforts to support breastfeeding, such as in WIC, the final rule implements this allowance. At SNAC for older infants, a vegetable or fruit must be served when it is developmentally appropriate for the infant, and as proposed, fruit juice is no longer allowed. We decided to maintain the proposal to add a vegetable or fruit at SNAC for the older infants because a recent comprehensive study on food intakes for infants showed that a substantial proportion of infants do not consume any vegetables or fruit in a given day, and it's never too early to start building healthy habits. Additionally, ready-to-eat cereals are now a grain option at SNAC as we proposed. For meat alternates, a large portion of commenters voiced opposition to the proposed rules restriction on cow's milk byproducts for infants, which includes cheese, cottage cheese, cheese food. While the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends restricting cow's milk prior to the first year, that recommendation does not extend to cow's milk byproducts, such as cheese. Rather, the AAP recommends that infants should eat from all food groups by 7 or 8 months of age. So with that, the new meal patterns allow cheese, cottage cheese, and yogurt. The current meal patterns allow cheese food and cheese spread. We are no longer allowing that in the new meal patterns due to cheese food and cheese spreads' high sodium content. The final rule also allows whole eggs to credit towards the meat alternate component for infants. Previously, only egg yolks were allowed due to concerns with developing food allergies when infants are exposed to the protein in the egg white. However, the AAP recently concluded there is no convincing evidence to delay the introduction of solid foods that are considered to be major food allergens, including eggs. All right, that is the infant meal pattern. So let's take a quick break for questions specifically on the infant meal pattern. There is one question on asking if there are any restrictions on yogurt. Yes, there are restrictions on yogurt, and I'm actually going to talk about that in the next section about the child and adult meal patterns. So you'll just have to wait. Can sponsors and facilities begin the new meal patterns before the final rules, June 24th, 2016 effective date? Sponsors and facilities may start implementing the new meal patterns as soon as possible. There are many pieces to the new meal patterns that are in line with what we currently require, such as you could stop serving cheese food or cheese spread, but things such as whether or not having a mother come on site to breastfeed and get reimbursed for that, we will be issuing additional guidance on those new sort of allowances that are not in line with the current meal pattern. So we hope to get that out in the next few weeks. One question is also, does that mean that solid foods can be introduced sooner than 6 months and still be reimbursable? Yes, under the new meal patterns, which again go into effect in October 1st, 2017, solid foods that are introduced before 6 months of age is reimbursable. We did get a question asking whether or not infant meals where breast milk is brought in, if that would be reimbursable. Yes, when a mother provides express breast milk, that is still reimbursable, and that is current policy, and we are continuing to maintain that for the final rule. So a mother can breastfeed on site, she can provide express breast milk, and both of those situations are reimbursable under the new meal patterns. We have another question, is juice prohibited from the infant meal pattern for all meals or just at snack? It is prohibited at all meals. We have a question is, if implemented early, when should we start disallowing for non-compliance? You cannot start disallowing until after the new meal patterns go into effect. Again, we will be providing additional guidance on that. All right. So I see there are a couple more questions, but in the interest of time, we are going to continue moving on. And we are collecting all of these questions that you're submitting and do plan on issuing a Q&A policy memo that will address frequently asked questions. So we will certainly be collecting all of those questions and getting answers to you. All right, next up is the child and adult meal pattern. The new meal patterns includes a new age group for children, 13 through 18-year-olds. This addition better reflects the characteristics of the population that CACFP serves, in particular, those children that are receiving meals at-risk after-school programs and emergency shelters. The meal pattern chart clearly indicates that the 13 through 18-year-old age group applies to the at-risk after-school programs and emergency shelters. The meal pattern requirements for the 13 through 18-year-old age group is the same as the meal patterns for the 6 through 12-year-olds. Larger serving sizes for the 13 through 18-year-old age group are not required because meal reimbursements remain unchanged. Of course, we recognize the importance of serving meals that meet the nutritional needs of all children participating in CACFP. We will make recommendations via policy guidance for serving meals to children 13 through 18 that build on the meal pattern requirements to ensure that this age group's nutritional needs are met. For vegetables and fruit, just as proposed, the final rule creates a separate vegetable component and a separate fruit component at lunch, supper, and snack. This is consistent with the National School Lunch Program, will help increase the variety of foods children are served, and allow centers and daycare homes to serve a vegetable and a fruit at snack. We heard from many commenters that centers and daycare homes should still be able to serve 2 vegetables at lunch and supper. These commenters cited that it would help increase the appeal of some meals, encourage further consumption of vegetables, and reduce the amount of fruit juice that's offered. Well, we agree. The dietary guidelines for Americans found that very few children consume the recommended amount of vegetables, while the majority of young children meet the recommended intake for fruits. You'll see here in this chart from the dietary guidelines that the blue line represents the range of recommended intake for vegetables and fruit, and the orange dot indicates the current intake of vegetables and fruit. As you can see, on average, young children ages 1 through 8 consume the recommended amount of fruit, but everyone falls short for how many vegetables they are eating. With this and menu planning in mind, the final rule allows 2 vegetables to be served at lunch and supper. If 2 vegetables are served, they must be 2 different kinds of vegetables. So it could be broccoli and green beans, but they do not need to be different from different vegetable subgroups. For example, a center or daycare home could serve a lunch meal with carrots and tomatoes, which are both from the red and orange vegetable group, and that is perfectly fine. For juice, the proposed rule would have allowed juice to be served multiple times per day and to comprise the entire vegetable or fruit component. This was concerning to many commenters, as juice contains less fiber than other types of fruit and is less satiating. To help encourage and improve children and adults' consumption of whole fruits and vegetables as recommended by the dietary guidelines, the new meal patterns limits juice to once per day. Juice may still comprise the entire vegetable or fruit component, but again, it can only be served once per day. We expect this to be feasible as several states already limit juice through their licensing requirements. Additionally, in the research we conducted, we found that centers and daycare homes are already serving juice about once per day on average. For grains, just as we proposed, the final rule requires at least 1 grain per day be whole grain rich. All Americans currently underconsume whole grains. This is another graphic from the dietary guidelines. Here the blue bar represents the range of recommended intake for whole grains and limits for refined grains. And the orange dot indicates current intakes of refined grains, and the green diamonds show current intakes of whole grains. Ideally, the orange dot and the green diamonds would fall within the blue bars. The new whole grain rich requirement will help children and adults increase their intake of whole grains and benefit from the important nutrients they provide. What does whole grain rich mean? Whole grain rich foods are foods that contain at least 50% whole grains and the remaining grains in the food are enriched. Or it can be a food that contains 100% whole grains. We will issue guidance in the near future outlining the specific criteria for a food to be considered whole grain rich. This will be the same criteria that is used in the National School Lunch Program to maintain consistency among the child nutrition programs. Just as presented in the proposed rule, the final rule disallows grain-based desserts because they are a source of added sugars and solid fats. In general, commenters supported limiting or disallowing grain-based desserts and asked for clarification on what is a grain-based dessert. And that's because we did not actually define grain-based desserts in the proposed rule. We wanted to hear from CACFP stakeholders what grain-based desserts meant to them. And many commenters provided suggestions for a definition. The final rule adopts one of the suggested definitions and defines grain-based desserts as those foods in USDA's Food Buying Guide, Exhibit A, which are denoted as desserts with superscripts 3 and 4. This is a very technical definition, but in essence, it means that cookies, cakes, sweet pie crusts, fruit turnovers, donuts, granola bars, toaster pastries, sweet rolls, and brownies would no longer be allowed in a reimbursable meal. In the proposed rule, the new meal patterns would require that breakfast cereals meet all of the WIC program's nutritional requirements for breakfast cereals, which includes a sugar limit, a certain amount of iron, and other nutrients. The majority of commenters supported a sugar limit of some sort, but they expressed concern that conforming to all the WIC nutrient standards would be too complicated, and this was for a couple of reasons. One, WIC-approved cereals vary by state, and additionally, a person cannot use the nutrition facts label to determine whether a cereal is compliant with the WIC nutrient standards for breakfast cereals. Therefore, this final rule focuses on our original intention of reducing added sugars and only adopts WIC's sugar limit on breakfast cereals. So under the new meal patterns, breakfast cereals served in CACFP must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. And lastly, for the grains requirement, the final rule uses ounce equivalents to determine the minimum serving sizes for the grains requirement. An ounce equivalent is the amount of a food product that is considered equal to 1 ounce from the grains component. So 1 ounce equivalent equals 16 grams of grains. You can think of it like a piece of cinnamon raisin bread. The raisins in the bread do not count towards the grain requirement. So ounce equivalence helps determine how much the slice of cinnamon raisin bread has to weigh in order for the slice to contain 16 grams of grains, credible grains. Commenters requested that CACFP switch to ounce equivalences for a couple of reasons. First, the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program use ounce equivalences. So this change increases consistency. We agreed with the commenters that it would be cumbersome to maintain 2 different grain serving size requirements. Second, the dietary guidelines for Americans in the USDA MyPlate food guidance system use ounce equivalents when making recommendations for individuals' intake of grains. Ounce equivalence ensures that the CACFP grains components reflects current nutrition science. We understand that this requires an operational change, and CACFP centers and daycare homes will need time to become familiar with ounce equivalences. Based on that, we are delaying the implementation of ounce equivalences until October 1st, 2019. Ooh, sorry about that, I moved slides. So starting October 1st, 2019, ounce equivalents will be required, and that's a full 2 years after the other meal pattern requirements are required. All right, now we can talk about meat alternates. So the final rule does make slight modifications to what we proposed. The proposed rule would have allowed a meat or meat alternate to be served in place of 1/2 of the grains requirement at breakfast. While some commenters were pleased to have a meat alternate incorporated into the breakfast meal, majority of commenters opposed it, primarily because they found it would be too complicated to implement and monitor. We agree that meat alternates are a good source of protein and have a host of vitamins and minerals. In recognizing the value of a meat alternate at breakfast, and to increase centers and daycare homes' choices when menu planning, and making it easier to implement, the new meal pattern allows meat or meat alternates to substitute for the entire grains component at breakfast a maximum of 3 times per week. In addition, the new meal patterns adopt the proposed rules allowance of tofu as a meat alternate. This was strongly supported by commenters. Allowing tofu will allow CACFP to better serve vegetarian diets and offer greater flexibility to the menu planner. The proposed rule also included 2 options for yogurt that we requested your feedback on. The 2 options were to either establish a sugar limit on yogurt as no more than 30 grams of sugar per 6 ounces, or to establish a best practice that would be optional and recommend that yogurt contain no more than 30 grams per 6 ounces. The vast majority of commenters supported a required sugar limit on yogurt, stating that it would not be burdensome, as most yogurts meet the proposed sugar limit of 30 grams, and it supports the goal of optimizing the nutritional quality of the meal served in CACFP. Some commenters went even further, and they asked us, FNS, to lower the sugar limit on yogurt. These commenters emphasized the importance of reducing children's consumption of added sugar and expressed a concern that the proposed sugar limit is too liberal, because only a few yogurts would be disallowed. After careful consideration, the new meal patterns requires that all yogurt served in CACFP contain no more than 23 grams of sugar per 6 ounces. We conducted extensive market research on the availability of yogurt within this sugar limit and found that yogurts containing no more than 23 grams of sugar per 6 ounces are widely available. Many do not contain artificial sweeteners, and these yogurts do not cost any more than other yogurts with more sugar. In addition, food and taste preferences, including preferences for sweet foods, are established at a young age. Requiring a sugar limit on yogurt reinforces that yogurt can be part of a healthful diet with less added sugar. We felt that it was particularly important to help reduce children's consumption of added sugars because the dietary guidelines found that added sugar consumption is particularly high in children. This is another graphic from the dietary guidelines. You'll see here that the blue dotted line represents the recommendation from the dietary guidelines to consume no more than 10% of calories from added sugars. The orange dot shows current intake of added sugars for each age and sex group. And you'll see that it's particularly high for children. For fluid milk, many of you are probably already familiar with some of the new meal pattern milk requirements, as many of them were originally put in place in September 2011 via policy memorandum. The final rule puts that policy into the CACFP regulations. So for fluid milk, 1-year-old children must be served whole unflavored milk in the new meal patterns, and 2-year-olds and older and adults must be served low-fat or fat-free milk. And a new allowance in the meal patterns is that yogurt may now be served in place of milk once per day for adults. Several commenters requested that we extend this allowance of yogurt in place of milk to children. We are not extending the flexibility to children because milk provides a wealth of nutrients children need, such as vitamin A and vitamin D. And comparable quantities are not currently found in available yogurts. And lastly, for fluid milk, the final rule adds the allowance of non-dairy beverages that are nutritionally equivalent to milk to be served in place of fluid milk for children and adults with special dietary needs. Again, this is consistent with current policy, and so we are just taking it from our policy memos to our regulations. For flavored milk, the proposed rule presented several options that we asked for comments on, just like we did with yogurt. So as you may remember, for children 0 through 4 years old, the rule proposed to prohibit flavored milk for that age group, or to set a sugar limit of no more than 22 grams of sugar per 8 fluid ounces. For children 5 and older and adults, it proposed to set a sugar limit on flavored milk of no more than 22 grams per 8 fluid ounces, or to make that sugar limit an optional best practice. The majority of commenters supported prohibiting flavored milk for children 0 through 4 and establishing a required sugar limit for flavored milk served to older children and adults. These commenters believed that flavored milk contributes to increased added sugar consumption and is not appropriate for young children whose taste preferences are being formed. The new meal patterns are truly intended to address the importance of children and adults eating nutritious meals while in daycare to foster healthy habits, prevent the development of obesity, and improve wellness. So with that in mind, The new meal patterns prohibits flavored milk for children 0 through 5 years old. As you'll notice, we made a slight modification in the age groups. What we proposed was prohibiting flavored milk for children 0 through 4, and the final rule prohibits flavored milk for children 0 through 5. This is just a minor technical change to better align with the meal pattern age groups, which go 1 to 2 and 3 to 5-year-olds. We expect this new requirement to be minimally burdensome because various commenters asserted that flavored milk is rarely served in CACFP. Additionally, multiple states currently prohibit flavored milk in childcare through their licensing requirements. In general, we agreed that it would be more challenging to monitor and implement a sugar limit on flavored milk, especially because milk is a required component at breakfast, lunch, and supper meals. And some providers mix their own flavored milk with syrup, so the sugar content would vary from batch to batch. Additionally, market research indicated that there's a limited selection of flavored milks within the proposed sugar limit. While providers may serve only on flavored milk and be in compliance, complying with a sugar limit on flavored milk when choosing to serve flavored milk may be particularly difficult or infeasible for providers living in rural areas with limited options. In recognition of these challenges, the final rule recommends as a best practice that flavored milk contain no more than 22 grams of sugar per 8 ounces. We recognize that more work is needed to be done, though, as the Dietary Guidelines does, for the first time ever, make a specific recommendation on added sugars, and as I mentioned, added sugar consumption is particularly high for children. The current research on the impact of flavored milk on energy intake and sugar consumption is limited. We will continue to assess the flavored milk best practice and will revise the best practice as nutrition science evolves and the market availability of lower sugar flavored milk improves. And finally, the new meal pattern also requires that flavored milk be fat-free as we proposed, which is just as they have it in the National School Lunch Program. Under food preparation, the final rule adopts the proposed rules requirement to prohibit centers and daycare homes from frying food as a way of preparing food on site, and it continues to allow providers to purchase pre-fried foods. Most commenters that discussed the frying provision supported it. However, many people's support was contingent on how we define frying, as the proposed rule did not specify what frying meant. A variety of commenters offered suggestions on how to define frying, and this final rule adopts a definition that was presented by commenters. Frying means deep fat frying, cooking by submerging in oil, hot oil, or other fat. By defining frying as deep fat frying, centers and daycare homes have great flexibility in how they choose to prepare their meals and may continue to saute, pan fry, and stir fry their foods. The final rule also maintains or slightly modifies several of the proposed rule's additional requirements. First, the new meal patterns prohibits the use of food and beverages as a reward or punishment. The proposed rule originally only prohibited food, and commenters pointed out that beverages should be included. The intent was for beverages to be included, so the final rule clarifies that beverages cannot be used as a form of punishment or reward, as milk and juice are parts of reimbursable meals. Second, the new meal patterns codifies the current policy to make water available to children throughout the day upon their request. It also requires providers to offer water to children. Commenters keenly noted that some CACFP participants, such as young toddlers, cannot verbally communicate or do not know how to ask for water. So this addition helps with that. Third, the final rule adopts the proposal to allow parents or guardians to provide one meal component for children or adults with non-disability medical or special dietary needs. Fourth, as proposed, the final rule codifies practices that are already in place that centers and daycare homes must follow when they choose to serve meals family style. And fifth, the new meal patterns extends offer versus serve to the at-risk after-school programs. as we proposed. And lastly, but certainly not least, the final rule also impacts a couple of other child nutrition programs. As we proposed, the rule revises the National School Lunch and School Breakfast meal patterns for children 0 through 4 to reflect the CACFP meal patterns. It also removes the option to use offer versus serve for meals served to children 0 through 4 in the National School Lunch and School Breakfast program. It also revises the special milk program milk requirements to match CACFP's milk requirements. These changes were made to better align our child nutrition programs and ensure that all preschool-age children are receiving the same nutritious meals. Okay, let's pause again for another Q&A session on the child and adult meal pattern requirements. Sorry, I'm just taking a quick second to look through your questions. One question is, can children 2 and older have 2% milk? No, low-fat milk refers to 1% milk. Someone asked if a 4-year-old is in a transitional kindergarten, is flavored milk prohibited? If a 4-year-old is in kindergarten, then they would be following the kindergarten meal patterns. We are not requiring that you would have to split out those age groups. So if a 5-year-old was in pre-K, you would be following the 0 through 4-year-old pre-K meal patterns. We have a question asking, do processed frozen foods such as chicken nuggets, french fries, that are pre-fried but typically baked or microwaved count as deep fat fried foods? Processed frozen foods that are purchased and are pre-fried by the manufacturer are not prohibited. The center or daycare home can still purchase and reheat and serve them, and it can be part of a reimbursable meal. As long as the center or daycare home doesn't preheat those items with frying. They can bake it, they can microwave it, as you mentioned. Well, I have a question of, will the center be required to ensure that the meal component supplied by the parent or guardian is an eligible item in CACFP? Consistent with our current policy around meal accommodations for special dietary needs that are not related to disabilities, the accommodations must be within the meal pattern requirements in order for it to be a reimbursable meal. Scrolling through some more of the questions. We have a question asking, how will yogurts with fruit in them be counted for CACFP, and also how would this affect the sugar content? Providers can continue to purchase yogurts that have mixer or the stir-in fruit that's at the bottom, and they would just be looking at the total sugar content on the nutrition facts label to determine whether or not it's within the sugar limit. So the nutrition facts label will have all the sugar content for the yogurt as well as the fruit in there, so that's just all combined into it. We have a question of, to the 1 juice per day limitation, is that restricted to a specific meal? No, it is across the entire day. So a center or daycare home can choose which meal they want to serve the juice at. And I will mention that we are going to be issuing guidance on that. Okay, someone has mentioned that they don't see that the allowance for 2 vegetables at lunch and supper on the handouts we have on our website. So they recommended that more guidance may be needed, and we'll certainly be issuing additional guidance on that. So thank you for pointing that out. One person has asked if there is a requirement similar to the National School Lunch Program for vegetables, such as serving green leafy vegetables once per week and a deep orange vegetable once per week. No, there is no requirement to serve a certain amount of vegetables from each of the vegetable subgroups. Someone has asked us to explain a little bit more about family-style meals. So centers and daycare homes may choose at their own discretion if they want to serve meals family style. And there are certain practices that must be followed when you serve meals family style. For example, the minimum serving size for each child must be put on the table. And so we're putting that policy or that practice into our regulations. Someone has asked us to clarify a little bit about the separation of the vegetable and fruit component, but centers can still offer 2 vegetables. Yes, so the meal pattern shows that there's a vegetable component and a fruit component at lunch and supper. A center or daycare home can choose to substitute the fruit component with another vegetable. So they can serve 2 vegetables at lunch or a fruit and a vegetable, but they just cannot serve 2 fruits. You guys have such good questions. We have a question about, can you explain the whole grain rich requirement once per day? Is it per child or facility? It is per the facility, and our guidance that we'll be issuing will clarify that. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move on and talk about the best practices. The final rule includes optional best practices. They're a vital tool to encourage centers and daycare homes to further strengthen the nutritional quality of the meals they serve. And the best practices serve as a guide by highlighting areas where the centers and daycare homes can, if they choose, take additional steps. The proposed rule would have codified the best practices into the regulations. We heard from a variety of commenters that including optional best practices in the regulatory text would be too confusing, and some centers and daycare homes may mistake them as requirements. We understand that completely, and so the best practices are not in the regulations, and they will be issued via policy guidance. The best practices reflect recommendations from the National Academy of Medicine, the dietary guidelines, and your public comments, but were not included as requirements due to cost or complexity. Child care providers have the unique ability to influence positive development early in a child's life, making it particularly important for providers to adopt the best practices and share strategies for successfully implementing them. The first best practice is for infant meals. Centers and daycare homes should support mothers who choose to breastfeed their infants by encouraging mothers to supply breast milk for their infants while in daycare and offer a quiet, private area that is comfortable and sanitary for mothers who come to the center or daycare home to breastfeed. This is slightly modified from what we have in the proposed rule. We added that the private area should be sanitary based on comments. Under vegetables and fruit, centers and daycare homes are encouraged to make at least one of the 2 required components of a snack a vegetable or fruit. Serve a variety of fruits and choose whole fruits, such as fresh, canned, frozen, or dried, more often than juice. This is new and was added to emphasize the importance of consuming a variety of whole fruits, as recommended by the dietary guidelines. It also encourages providers to provide at least 1 serving each of dark green vegetables, red and orange vegetables, beans and peas, starchy vegetables, and other vegetables once per week. This is only slightly modified from what we had proposed and added in all of the vegetable subgroups. For grains, the best practice is to provide at least 2 servings of whole grain rich grains per day. For meat alternates, serve only lean meats, nuts, and legumes. Limit serving processed meats to no more than 1 serving per week. And serve only natural cheeses and choose low-fat or reduced-fat cheeses. This last one was slightly modified. We added in choosing low-fat or reduced-fat cheeses, which is recommended by the dietary guidelines. For milk, the best practice has been modified based off of what we did with the requirements. So the best practice is to serve only unflavored milk to all participants. If flavored milk is served to children 6 years old and older, or adults, it's recommended that the nutrition facts label be used to select and serve flavored milk that contains no more than 22 grams of sugar per 8 fluid ounces, or the flavored milk with the lowest sugar amount if a flavored milk with that sugar limit is not available. Serve water as a beverage when serving yogurt in place of milk for adults. This is a brand new best practice. In the proposed rule, we asked what types of beverages would be served in meals when yogurt is substituting for fluid milk. Commenters suggested that water be served, so we are adding that as a best practice. The additional best practices are to incorporate seasonal and locally produced foods into meals. This is new, as seasonal and locally produced foods can help children learn where foods come from, and it can help improve the quality of the meal. Limit serving purchased pre-fried foods to no more than 1 serving per week. This was modified from the proposed best practice simply to clarify the difference between the required prohibition of frying foods on site and the best practice. The best practice for frying pertains to foods that are purchased, such as at the grocery store, and then served. These foods must be reheated any method other than frying, as I mentioned earlier. Another additional best practice is to avoid serving non-credible foods that are sources of added sugars, such as sweet toppings, such as honey and jam and syrup, mixing ingredients filled with yogurt like honey, candy, or cookie pieces, and sugar-sweetened beverages. This is a new best practice, and it was added to further help reduce children's consumption of added sugars. And lastly, we are recommending that adult daycare centers offer and make water available to adults upon their request throughout the day. And this is a reflection of the requirement for children with water. Let's talk about implementation. Now that we have these wonderful new meal patterns, how are we going to implement them? With an implementation date of October 1st, 2017, CACFP sponsors, centers, and daycare homes have about a year and a half to comply with the new meal pattern requirements. We put together an implementation plan to make sure that we successfully get from here to there. It includes a new CACFP webpage, policy guidance, team nutrition resources, and train-the-trainer trainings for state agencies. So other than today's webinar, where can you learn about the new meal patterns? We have our webpage that you can see the URL here on the slide. We have several resources ready to go on the website. We updated the website on Friday to reflect the information from the new meal patterns. It includes links to the final rule as well as a press release, new meal pattern charts, and one-page summaries of the new meal patterns. On the slide are snapshots of those one-page summaries. You can find the CACFP Meal Standards page on the left sidebar of our homepage, as you can see here. This is the top half of that new web page. It includes some background information on the revision of the CACFP meal patterns. And on the second half, you will find information and resources for the new meal patterns. The CACFP Meal Patterns webpage still has the old meal pattern charts because centers and daycare homes do not need to comply with the new meal patterns until October 1st, 2017. You'll also notice a new section that's titled Guidance and Technical Assistance. This section provides resources to help you, sponsors, centers, and daycare homes implement the new meal patterns. We'll add to it as more resources come out. And I've been talking a lot about policy guidance. So when are those coming? We've put together a timeline for the policy guidance we'll be issuing soon to further help clarify the new meal pattern requirements. In the late spring or early summer, we'll be issuing guidance on the best practices, the grains requirements, and milk requirements. The milk requirements will be a revision of the current memo we have on milk. In the summer, we'll be issuing guidance on the introduction of solid foods for infants and offer versus serve in the at-risk after-school program. In the fall, we'll issue a memorandum with a compilation of the Q&As that we've received, a memo on the vegetables and fruit components, tofu, and water. And then in the winter of 2016-2017, we'll issue guidance for meal serve for 13 through 18-year-olds and parent and guardian provided components. We'll also be issuing additional guidance on frying somewhere in that timeline. FNS will be reviewing the food buying guide for child nutrition programs and make changes as necessary based on the new CACFP meal patterns. To help centers and daycare homes comply with this new standard, we are developing resources in English and Spanish. These materials will assist with the transition from the old to the new meal patterns and illustrate how to select whole grain rich foods, use healthier cooking techniques, and choose foods that are lower in added sugars. We are also cooking up new standardized recipes for CACFP that reflect a variety of cultures. Together with the new menu planning training resources, these tools will help centers and daycare homes put the new meal patterns into practice in a way that works for their setting and the kids they serve. Under the Team Nutrition Initiative, we are working to develop new educational resources for early child care as well as after-school programs. These efforts will help children and their caregivers learn about food and nutrition and will provide opportunities to try new foods in a positive and encouraging environment. Under the Team Nutrition Initiative, we'll also release an update to the very popular Feeding Infants Guide and materials to support breastfeeding within CACFP. Currently, state agencies can apply for a Team Nutrition Training Grant to implement and evaluate nutrition education, training, and technical assistant activities to support implementation of USDA nutrition standards for meals and snacks served through CACFP. Up to $6.8 million is anticipated for fiscal year 2016 for Team Nutrition Training Grants. Through a competitive grants process, Team Nutrition Training Grants will be funded for the period of September 30th, 2016 through September 30th, 2019, a full 3 years. Up to $500,000 may be requested per state agency. Grant applications must be submitted through grants.gov by May 20th, 2016. So that deadline's coming up soon. And lastly, our partnerships. We continue to partner with the Institute of Child Nutrition, formerly known as the National Food Service Management Institute. The ICN is in the process of developing a train-the-trainer program specifically on the new meal patterns. The training will first be available to FNS regional offices and then state agencies. State agencies will be able to use this training to train your sponsors. We also continue to work with CACZ advocacy groups to help implement the new meal patterns. And with that, we will take our last round of Q&As on the best practices and implementation. We have a question asking if the USDA crediting guide is being updated.
Hi, so this is Sheldon Gordon. So we are working on updating that materials, and so we plan to have that out shortly. We are reviewing all meal pattern questions regarding CACFP, so we're going to be reviewing a whole host of those things, and they will be posted to our website.
We have a question whether or not will water be reimbursable. It is not reimbursable, but in our current policy memo, it does allow that for water to be, under certain circumstances, an allowable cost if water is not safe and someone needs to purchase bottled water. Someone has asked if a person flavors their fat-free milk for children 6 years old and older, how will you calculate the sugar from milk and flavoring from this chocolate syrup? The sugar limit for the 6-year-olds and older on flavored milk is only a best practice, so it's optional, and we will not be monitoring it. So you would not need to calculate how much sugar is in the flavored milk. Just scrolling through your questions. So I have a question about the fruit and vegetable component. So they've asked if they can serve many combinations except fruits and fruit as long as the minimum serving size for both added to 3/4 of a cup. Is this correct? The meal pattern specifically specifies how much fruit and vegetable must be served. It's about even for all of the age groups except for, I believe, the 6 through 12 and 13 through 18-year-old age group, where it requires a little bit more vegetable. So you do need to pay attention to those minimum serving requirements because they do vary just a little bit. We've been asked to repeat what sections of the food buying guide that specify grain-based desserts. That is in the grains chapter, and it's Exhibit A. We've been asked when we'll be providing in-person training for state agencies. That is the work we are doing with the Institute of Child Nutrition, and while we are heavily involved in the development of that program or that training, we are not 100% positive on the timeline. That's something ICN is overseeing. We are hoping for it to be out in the near future. We can't quite speak on the timeline on that, unfortunately. Someone has asked if our first policy memo will include details on crediting meals between now and the implementation date. Yes. Someone has asked about the clarification on the best practices. Is it recommended that a fruit or vegetable be one of the snack components every day? It is a best practice, and it's just whenever you are serving snack, yes, that at least one component be a vegetable or fruit. However, again, it's just a best practice. It's optional, and it is not something we would be monitoring. All right, you guys are asking a lot of great questions about the meal patterns. Do you have any other questions about the implementation or the best practices? And again, we are recording all of these questions that you are submitting, so they will be very helpful for us when we are issuing policy guidance, so we can make sure that we're answering and clarifying all of the questions you have. All right, well, in closing, the new meal patterns requirements are cost neutral, they're achievable, and they make significant improvements to the nutritional quality of the meal served in CACFP. The new meal patterns lay the foundation for a healthy eating pattern, the best practices help kick it up a notch, and the forthcoming resources and trainings will provide the tools needed so that together we can and will successfully implement the new meal patterns. Thank you for participating today.